So without further ado, this is Amalia Hawkins talking about ignorance is strength, learning documentation or writing documentation by learning as you go.
Thank you, Eric. Okay, is my volume okay for everyone in the back right now? Can you guys hear? Louder? Awesome. Okay, so my name is Amalia, and I work at MongoDB as a software developer. And today I'm here to talk to you about how ignorance can be a strength. And those of you who maybe read 1984 in high school, or more recently, are probably looking at me right now like, what is she saying? Like, how is ignorance a strength? Traditionally, in documentation, we want to spread knowledge. And sort of ignorance is the enemy. Ignorance is a weakness that we want to overcome. But my premise that I'm here to try and convince you of today is that the struggle against ignorance and the frustration that comes from overcoming that ignorance can be one of the most creative and productive times for writing documentation. Documenting that struggle, you can often relate best to the future users or the future readers who are going to need to overcome their own ignorance. And before I get too far into this, I'd like to take a moment to sort of introduce myself and why I'm here talking about this today. I graduated college this past May with your generic degree in computer science. And I didn't do anything documentation specific in college. My main activity was actually TAing. And specifically, one of my roles as a lead TA for an intro computer science was the hiring of about 30 undergraduate TAs for an intro computer science course. And the main lesson that comes out of hiring these TAs is that even though you might expect that the best TAs to come out of the straight A students, the kids who immediately understood the material, who breezed through the class, that's actually not the case. The best TAs are often the ones who struggled the hardest with the material, the kids who got Bs or even Cs, or the kids who got As but had to really try very hard to get to that point. Because those kids are the students who turn into the best TAs, the TAs who can understand the students' problems and who can lead those students through their own struggles with the material. So, I graduated college and I went to work a couple months later in August at MongoDB, which is an open source database company. So it's a very technology-focused company. And as I said, had a generic kind of education. I had a lot of ignorance and a lot of enthusiasm, and that was about it. And like many a new hire at any company, I was faced very early on with a very large code base that I needed to sort of start getting a handle on. So I'm sure many of you can sort of relate to showing up at a company on your first day or your first week and being faced with something that looks like this. And in our case, our code base is something like 1.4 million lines of code, so there's a lot of this to sort of get your head around. And as a new hire, I had a sort of project I was working on as like a first project, and I had to start learning this code base, so how did I do it? Similarly to what you guys are doing now, a lot of it was just looking at the code and trying to decipher it. And that could kind of tell me what the code was doing and how the code was doing it. I could also look at user-facing documentation, which our company has a lot of, to understand what the user-facing parts of the product had to perform as. And then finally, I could ask more senior engineers questions. And I could say, hey, I don't understand how this particular segment of the code is working. Can you help me out? Just explain it to me. But at a certain point, all those strategies fall short. And the point at which the strategy of reading the code falls short is when you need to understand the internal mechanics and design decisions. Because reading code can tell you a lot about the how and the what, but it really can't tell you the why. You can't look at a piece of code and know exactly what the person who wrote it was thinking. You can't look at it and know what's the best way that they expected me to use this thing they wrote. And you can't always ask other people at the company this question because maybe the person left the company who wrote the code. Maybe they haven't worked on it in 12 months and they've forgotten how it works. Maybe they're busy. So asking around also fails as a strategy. And for me, where the rubber hit the road on this issue was with a thing called contexts, which the issue that I had was I just ran into this concept and I needed to figure it out to proceed with my work. And I spent 2 weeks struggling with this one thing called context, and I just couldn't figure it out. And so this kind of goes into a sort of larger lesson, which is that a lack of internal documentation hurts a company's attempts to scale. It makes knowledge transfer inside the company very difficult because you have the only way that you can transfer knowledge is to explain things to people. Training new engineers is already really difficult, right? It's a really tough problem, and often new engineers aren't really productive to the company for months after they're hired. And that hurts a company, especially if you're small or if you're trying to scale rapidly. And so this impacts hiring. It also impacts the ability of different teams across the company to talk to each other. So in our case, we have database engineers, but we also have a lot of other teams who rely on the product. Teams like support, teams like external services around the database, who, when they run into a problem, maybe they don't have the time to do what I did and spend 2 weeks trying to read the code figuring out what's happening. They need an answer. They have to go ask the engineers on the server. So it slows everyone down. And the final thing is that it not only does it make it difficult to scale, as I would say, scale vertically in the number of people you're hiring, it makes it difficult to scale horizontally, say open up new offices in California or internationally, because time zones become a problem. Communication across languages becomes a problem. How can these people, if you're trying to say what we once tried to do, scale out our database team to California as well as New York? And we had a lot of trouble there because the new database engineers in California had to continuously be talking to the ones in New York to ask them questions because of this lack of internal documentation. So how does this relate back to me with contexts? After spending 2 weeks struggling with this concept, I realized that, look, I still don't completely understand it. And the way I finally understood the concept was I got 10 minutes with the CTO of the company and co-founder, and he sat me down and gave me an explanation. Oh, and I'm switching mics. One sec. Just leave it on. And what contexts are is they're basically a way to maintain information about the state of the database and the current connections to it. But let's look at what I went through to get that information. I spent 2 weeks struggling, and then I got 10 minutes with the CTO. Neither of those are scalable, right? Like, every time you have a question about the product, you can't go bother the CTO. That really doesn't work. So the problem becomes that I was sort of like, well, we have this internal documentation problem, but I wasn't even thinking that far at this point. I was just thinking, okay, contexts. The next person cannot spend 2 weeks struggling with this. What do I do? So what I did was, I was like, okay, I have a lot of frustration right now. Why don't I just write a rant about how much I hate contexts and what's wrong with them? And then the next person will sort of have something to go off of. But as you can imagine, as a new employee, right, this was like 2 months after I'd started work, it felt pretty audacious to stand there and be like, look, I'm the one who knows all this stuff about context. I'm going to write the resource that's going to help people out. It wasn't something I was necessarily comfortable doing because I felt like there were a lot of gaps with my knowledge. That I was still very ignorant and just couldn't really put together the perfect resource on contexts. And what happened was I actually got lunch with our head of documentation to talk to him about this, and he said, look, write anything. Write something that's completely wrong, and start from there. And so that was kind of my first lesson, which is write anything, because something that's wrong is better than nothing. And I realize this is a very controversial statement, so let me clarify. You don't want to publish something that's incorrect, but once you write something wrong, it's very easy for others to come in and critique it and nitpick it and turn it into something good. So writing something that's wrong as a first draft can turn into something that's really good and right and productive, whereas writing nothing is just going to continue this almost culture of having nothing written. So just getting those first ideas down, even if they're wrong, can create a productive resource for the future. So that's basically what I did. I wrote this 1,300-word, literally a rant about contexts and what the problems with it was, how you could kind of avoid those problems, the pitfalls that I personally had fallen into, and how I got around them so that the next person using them wouldn't run into the same problem.
And I blurred this out so you don't try and spend time reading it because it's probably very dry to anyone who doesn't have to work with it. But I wrote this 1,300-word rant, and I sent it to the two people who were kind of most familiar with context for a sort of peer review process, and then sort of got this thing published on our internal wiki and emailed it out. And the response was really positive, which I wasn't really expecting, because I knew it had frustrated me, and I expected it would frustrate a couple other people. But there were actually a much bigger response than I expected, saying, look, like, this is really cool, actually. I had always seen those, but I wasn't really sure what they were doing, or I didn't realize this was part of our code, but now that I know, it can kind of make me more productive. And the other response I got was, wow, it's really great that someone wrote something about this. It would also be great if somebody wrote something about these other topics. So that kind of led to my second lesson, which is oftentimes as a new engineer or a new member at a company, whether you're in documentation or engineering, you start to think, I'm confused because I'm new, or I'm confused because I'm not very good, or whatever. And you kind of forget this lesson of like imposter syndrome, that everyone around you is probably confused about something, right? Like your ignorance, you're not the only one who's ignorant about something. Everyone has something to learn, and everyone's probably confused about something else. So specifically with regards to internal documentation, this was the point where I realized, look, there are all these other things that people want documented, or things that people are willing to have documented, or willing to help document. So why don't we make this a bigger thing and create a hub where you can encourage people to write things down as they move through their struggle of ignorance to knowledge. But this is really hard to ask of people, right? Especially when you're maybe interested in documentation at your company, but your coworkers aren't necessarily, right? It's hard to ask them, look, I know you have all this work to do, and this isn't necessarily on your actual list of like to-do list that your manager has given you, but I want you to spend an hour and write me something. And there are kind of two, I think, main strategies to combating this. The first is that writing is thinking, right? When you write about something, that's the best way of learning it. And this goes back to the idea of TAing, right? When I was hiring intro TAs, maybe they didn't completely understand the material the first time they TA'd that class. But you can bet damn sure by the second time they TA'd that class, they knew it back to front. Because when you teach something, that is the best way of reinforcing it and the best way of making sure you actually understand it. And that's kind of a truism people repeat, but it's actually very true. So for junior engineers especially, having to write about a feature or write about an internal mechanic or design decision will make sure that they actually understand it and help them become more acquainted with the code base. The other main strategy that we used was to take what I refer to as take the burden of writing nice things off of the engineers. So oftentimes, at least I know in my college career, engineers aren't really expected to take writing classes and maybe don't really enjoy writing as much as the actual technical documentation staff might, or even anyone else might. So the way we dealt with this problem was to split the work up into 3 distinct parts and have it so that the engineers who were struggling through overcoming their ignorance could kind of write something frustrated like the rant I had written, right? Something like a bulleted list of their thoughts, or maybe it was a GChat session in which they were just like typing away as they thought, or maybe it was a text file where they were taking notes as they learned something, or a stream of consciousness, just like conversation in the cafe, just getting their ideas out there. Then a second person would go through and sort of format that rant or those bullets into an actual article format. And then a third person would be responsible for the peer review and critiquing of the correctness. And in this way, we sort of spread out the work so that it was much easier for people to write these articles quickly without feeling like they were putting in too much effort and taking too much time away from their critical path. So after a while, and it was about 3 weeks or 4 weeks later, we managed to get a good selection of articles, of which these are some of. And they sort of spanned the topics from how-tos on like how to get set up with the code base, the sort of onboarding the last talk talked about. Also things like just internal mechanics, things about security, things about how to build the test suite. And the one thing you'll probably notice from looking at these titles is that they're not really professional, right? This isn't the sort of thing that you're publishing outside the company. This is very much for internal engineers, like by internal engineers and documentarians, to sort of help them in their path while they're actually working, right? So it doesn't have to be the most polished technical writing. We don't have to worry about things like tone, which sort of gives us an advantage in being able to move quickly. We can just sort of write these resources for use. So MongoDB is an open source company. So our sort of what's next with this internal documentation resource is reflected by that, which is that we have a good selection of articles internally now, and obviously want to continue to grow that. But we also have a lot of outside contributors, and we want to be able to leverage our community to contribute back to the database, which is something that they're very passionate about. So we're currently in the process of trying to clean up a lot of those articles and publish and sort of redesign and republish our outside contributors guide to sort of leverage those materials. So even though this started out as an internal documentation process to help our engineers, we can now sort of take the fruits of that and turn it into something more externally focused for people outside the company. So really, what I hope I've gotten across to you guys in this talk is that though you come into something completely ignorant, that ignorance doesn't have to be a weakness. That ignorance can actually be your greatest strength. Because in combating that ignorance and in working through it and in being frustrated in those weeks where you're just like, I'm not getting anything done because I don't understand anything, that can actually be the most creative time for the writing of documentation, because it is at that moment that you are experiencing the same thing that future users, future code writers are going to have to go through. So I would encourage you to go forth in your ignorance, and the next time you feel like you don't know something, don't take that as a setback, take that as a benefit, because that is the time where you are going to give the most to future readers. And that's my talk. So thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to either take questions now or if you want to find me later.
Hello? So I don't know if I'm the only one here, but I actually am interested in reading that rant about database contexts. So I mean, I don't know if you're even can share it if it's something from inside your company, but I would like to see it if you can share it.
I might be a little too embarrassed for that. I have to point out that it was very frustrating, but I could possibly at least publish an excerpt of it when they put my slides up, if that would be helpful. Maybe just that article. Yeah, I think I could definitely do that. Yeah, hopefully you don't think it's representative of my mind state all the time, because I think I referred to C++ as a pit of vipers somewhere in that rant.
Sounds accurate.
But yes, definitely, I'll try and make that available with my slides.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that you may be new at this, but you've discovered one of the most important things about writing ever that I remind people about all the time and remind myself about all the time, which is to get your crappy draft out there early. And I think that's so important. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm glad that that resounds well with you, because it was literally like I was sitting down with our head of like technical documentation at Mongo, and I was like, I know this needs to be written, but someone else should write it. And he was like, no. He was like, just write something totally wrong. So
everyone starts with ignorance.
What's your process for moving between the internal docs that you've written and getting those published into a sort of public, consumable format?
So that's actually the thing that I'm grappling with right now, so I'm glad you asked. it's a lot of cleaning up of the tone for me. And that's not something that I'm doing. I'm actually working very closely with our documentation team because they're kind of more acquainted with that. Because when you're writing internally, you don't really have to worry about maintaining a consistent tone throughout the documents. You can be very casual about things and sort of unprofessional. And you can also sort of express a lot of things that might not be as accessible to people outside the company, like, oh, if you don't understand this, go ask like Matthias. But somebody outside the company is not going to be able to go ask like Matthias because they do not work in the same office as the rest of us, right? So you need to fill in a lot of the blanks. You also can't expect the same amount of knowledge about the other aspects of the database. So I might be able to say, contexts work a lot like this other thing. But somebody outside, might not be acquainted with that part. They might just need to learn one aspect of the database to get their contribution in. So it's also about sort of filling in those gaps and being less casual about it. Say are the main things. Okay, looks like we're good. Thanks, everyone.